right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you to the folks who are out in the garden too. And thank you for coming to the 2014 season of Food in the Garden. I'm Susan Evans. I'm the program director of the American Food History Project here at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And I am thrilled to be sitting here in this beautiful Victory Garden that has been created by Smithsonian Gardens, who are our amazing partners in this endeavor. So this is the second week of our season. We had a great week last week talking about Long Island Sound. Now, how many of you in the audience, was anyone with us last week? Oh, thank you for the repeat visits. We appreciate that, and welcome to the people who this is your first time with us. So as some of you learned last week, at Food in the Garden this year, we're looking at the history and the legacy of the War of 1812. 2014 is the 200th anniversary of the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner after the Battle of Baltimore. And we here at the American History Museum are the home of that very flag that Francis Scott Key was looking at as he wrote the lyrics to what later became our national anthem. So we're doing lots of things this year to mark the anniversary. And at Food in the Garden, we're actually looking at 4 waterways that were impacted by the War of 1812, an often underappreciated war. And we're looking also at what's happening in those regions in terms of eating and growing, both in 1812 and today. So we're bringing together researchers, practitioners, farmers, educators, all here in this beautiful Victory Garden to help us understand those questions. So Food in the Garden is actually just one of the initiatives of the American Food History Project here at the museum, and we are actually opening a new demonstration kitchen in the museum next summer, so we hope that you will all be joining us for many more programs. And we would love your feedback, both on tonight's event and on ideas for future programs as we continue to shape the way we are talking about food at the museum. And of course, it is completely socially acceptable to have both your fans and your phones out because you'll all be tweeting with your friends, telling them what a great time you're having, using the hashtag Food in the Garden. And it's also meant to be a completely relaxed evening, so if you want to get up, God, something just settled, right? It just got really hot. Yeah. Excuse me. So, if you'd like to get up and get a second drink or take a little break, you're of course welcome to do that. We'll be up here for about 20 minutes, and we know that in 20 minutes, there is no way we will cover 200 years of history at all. But this is just supposed to spark the conversation, and we're excited to have all of you continue that dialogue out in the garden with all of our experts. So before I get started, I'd like to give a special thank you to the generous supporters who made this evening possible. We want to thank DuPont and also the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts. They are both great partners who have supported our efforts to have conversations around how Americans understand themselves through our shared food history. I'd also like to thank our in-kind donors who have brought you the sips you're sipping and the food on your plate. You are enjoying a fabulous Bloody Mary cocktail from DC's own Green Hat Gin, and also an oyster stout from Delaware's Flying Dog Brewery. And you should all go and hear about the oyster recovery efforts that Flying Dog is undertaking in the Chesapeake as well. And we also want to thank our food supporter, Wegmans, and a huge thank you to our chef, William Bednar, who's made all of the amazing food you're eating. And of course, another thank you to the amazing team that puts this all together. As you can imagine, this is not a one-woman process. There are a lot of people who work together across the Smithsonian to make this all possible. So, as we all know, as residents of the Chesapeake Bay region, the productive waters of the bay have really shaped this region's foodways. And the Chesapeake was actually one of the first regions to experience the War of 1812. And as I mentioned, this is a special year for the War of 1812 in this region. 200 years ago, the British burned down the Capitol building and the White House in DC. And then, of course, 200 years to the day from this coming Sunday, Francis Scott Key wrote the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner after the Battle of Baltimore. So we've been really into the War of 1812, and we're excited to talk about all this history that's happening in our own backyard. So today we'll be looking at the diverse cultural connections that came together during the War of 1812. And we'll take a look at the long-term impact of these connections on the bay's marine environment and resources. So with us today to discuss all this and more is Molly Rideout, who is at the end there. She is the Director of Horticulture for Historic Annapolis Foundation. And next to her, we have Psyche Williams-Forson, an Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, where she teaches and researches on cultural history, material culture, and food in the late 19th and 20th centuries, among other fascinating topics. And to my right, we have Denise Breitberg, who is a marine ecologist at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which we will refer to as CERC during this presentation. And that's actually a Smithsonian unit that studies interactions among species and the ways that individual animals, communities, and ecosystems respond to changes in the environment. So, Denise, from your perspective as a marine ecologist, what is so significant about the Chesapeake Bay?
Well, a lot of times we, think about all the problems that Chesapeake Bay has, but I think we forget what an amazing productive system it also is. I mean, even now, 3/4 of the rockfish along the whole East Coast start their lives in Chesapeake Bay. 85% of the menhaden, which is the second biggest fishery in the U.S., are caught in Virginia, and it's also played a really important historical role in the movement of people along the East Coast. Once upon a time, the oysters in Chesapeake Bay were also phenomenally productive. And as populations got depleted up in New York and in New England, all those fishermen came down to the Chesapeake Bay and settled in this area.
So where is the Chesapeake Bay watershed if we're looking at the whole region of the Chesapeake Bay?
Well, it includes parts of New York and Pennsylvania, tiny bit of West Virginia, a little bit of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, so it's a huge watershed. And actually, if you look at the watershed compared to the water area, it's got more land associated with it than really any other estuary in the world.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. So around the War of 1812, Molly, what was going on in this region? What were people eating? What were people growing? And how was that impacting their daily lives?
Well, it's sort of ironic that we begin with that time period, because maybe the big story at that time was the food that wasn't there. Because at that time the British were blockading the coast. They were fighting the war 3,000 miles from home and needed to feed sailors. So they were actually landing on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay and raiding farmsteads, burning buildings, stealing livestock, stealing food supplies that people had, stored for feeding their family over the coming months. So that was a very present danger in the minds of our local residents here. And then, from that, which affected, even the lowest echelons of society, we go all the way up to the White House, which 200 years ago, a few weeks ago, was vacated by the Madisons, and supposedly the Madison's dinner was eaten by the British troops when they marched into the White House, so there was another meal that went missing. Whether or not that meal was really laid by Dolly Madison before she vacated, we don't know. But
makes a nice story.
It makes a great story. So yeah, when we think about the War of 1812, we first think about danger to our food supply, which is maybe sort of interesting that we nowadays talk about endangered food supplies too.
Oh, that's interesting.
From different reasons for it. But when people were eating in those days, which most of the time they were, they had a diet that relied heavily on meat, livestock that they raised, plus game that they caught, fish, which Diane can talk to us more about. But also, of course, they were growing a lot of vegetables, and as I've prepared to come here this evening, I've looked through a lot of lists of people who were growing in the early 19th century, and really, what weren't they eating? Probably not tomatoes, but they in fact had as wide a palette of vegetables that you might find in the grocery store now. Obviously lots of root vegetables because they would keep very well, but greens, salad greens, are sort of a myth that they didn't eat salads in the old days, but in fact they actually did, and there are recipes for putting together a salad. No tomatoes in them, no. They were entirely, collections of greens. Many vegetables, all the ones that were brought to our cuisine by Native Americans, including corn and squash and pumpkins and beans, all came into, the English-based cuisine that was brought over by the settlers.
And who was growing this food? Who was growing this food for people?
Well, a lot of people were growing it for themselves.
Okay.
Although, of course, there were markets.
Mhm.
I don't know that much about rural areas around the Chesapeake Bay, but certainly in Annapolis there was a market right there. We have diaries of people in Annapolis who clearly
Oh,
went
neat.
to market several times a week to
Yeah.
buy produce that, you know, perhaps was more than what they could grow in their own backyard.
Great. So Psyche, from your research, can you talk a bit about African American foodways in the
Right,
region at that time, and how that played into some of the other stories we
Right.
know, even some of those Deli Madison-esque stories. What's the
Right,
relationship
right,
there?
right. Well, I guess to piggyback on what Molly said, it was a really complex situation for African American people because you had both enslaved and freed. You had some African American men and some families actually who fought on the side of the British because they were promised freedom. But then you also had a number of African Americans who fought on the side of America. So you had them in multiple places. In terms of growing food, because you're talking about a gang system versus a task system in Maryland, because you're talking mostly tobacco being grown. So therefore, their time, enslaved people's time, was not their own, right? And so many of them did have gardens, but that was really only if they were allowed to do so. And then by 1812, you had a number of African American women who, because now we're 2 generations out of the first Africans arriving on this continent, and so you have African American women who are going to that marketplace. Again, if they're allowed, but then they are, and the legal statutes are just full of all kinds of notations where it was illegal to barter and trade with many of these women. So what they did, very ingenuously, a lot of times they would do their trade on the way to the market, which really meant
Yeah.
that they could command any
Yeah.
price, and that also became illegal. So it was a really interesting way that they acquired and also passed on different foodways.
Yeah. So we titled this week Cultural Connections, hoping to get at some of those connections of cultures, both what African Americans brought here with them in terms of foodways, but also what other groups brought to the Chesapeake region. As Janice was saying, the Chesapeake has always been this crossroads of transportation. So what are some of those specific foodways or food stories that get to the heart of that cultural connection story in that time period?
Actually, I think there are a number of contributions that Africans brought into our cuisine, and particularly as it was filtered through the Caribbean, as they, as slavery came to the Caribbean first for the sugar plantations, and then up here to the Mid-Atlantic. I was talking with one of the gardeners a little earlier about the plant that they're featuring this week is the fish pepper, and that was an African American plant. Well, for starters, just bringing spiciness into our food was an important African contribution because they were used to they had a pepper in Africa, although different from the peppers that we have here, but they quickly sought out things that suited their palate and added those to our cuisine. So that was that connection with a different type of palate was important in developing our present day cuisine.
Right, but it's important to remember that Africans themselves did not bring these foods.
Right.
And I have to make that point because there's this myth that tends to circulate that enslaved people bought these seeds and so forth on their person. Well, if you're being chased and captured, you're not stopping to pick up, any kind of seeds. But actually, they came over on the slave ships, right? The Portuguese ships brought some of those foods.
The captains needed to stock
they needed to
ships
stock,
for the crossing, so they were buying
Absolutely.
their supplies in West Africa.
And often didn't feed, the enslaved people the foods that they, would have been familiar with, right? And so few actually made it across the Middle Passage during that formal period. I mean, there's the probably real truism that, sharks would follow these ships because they knew bodies were going overboard and so forth. That's not hard to fathom. But absolutely, not only did Africans bring different types of foods, but also preparation methods. Yeah, cooking, smoking tubers in leaves over coals, burying tubers underground, and so forth. And so there was this admixture, right? This creolization that, of course, takes place in and around food culture with the engagement of European people and native peoples as well.
So, what do you see as some of the legacies of these transported flavors and styles in the foodways of the Chesapeake region today?
Thoughts?
Okay.
Well, I think we saw some of them on the plate. I mean,
Yeah.
the colors, the preservation methods, the pickling. You know, Africans didn't necessarily bring pickling, but what they were able to do in terms of presentation, in terms of cooking one-pot meals. And so we see a lot of that still, you know, flavoring, I think, salt, adding, you
Yeah.
know, salt flavoring, and like you said, spicy malagueta peppers, fire, you know, fire peppers and so forth. And so all of that becomes part of the contribution to New World cuisine, if you will.
So there was a lot going on, even though there were limits to how much food there was coming into the region. There were still things happening in that region. So today, Denise, what are the things that you see as some of the scientific research, the changes that have been happening in the Chesapeake Bay over the time you've been working in it?
Well, for one thing, the fisheries
Mm-hmm.
have certainly had an impact on Chesapeake Bay, especially oyster populations have gone down. But what we've seen in terms of oysters in Chesapeake Bay really is just a reflection of what we see around the world. Wild
Okay.
oyster populations really can't support really heavy fisheries, and what we're now doing in Chesapeake Bay is the same thing that's happened in Europe much earlier, which is shifting more towards an aquaculture um, mode of production.
And can you
which
explain
is-
aquaculture to people who've never heard the
so
word?
we're essentially farming instead of hunting, is what we're starting to do.
Great.
And we're adapting our fisheries to, in some ways, help with some of the problems. Invasive species are, you know, cause problems around the world, whether it's kudzu growing, you know, out of control, or you know, insects that we don't want. And in marine systems or in a bay like Chesapeake Bay, once something is there, you really can't get it out because you can't find every last one.
Yeah.
And one of the strategies that is now being adopted is to essentially create fisheries, create markets for some of these fish. And so blue catfish, which were initially introduced in Virginia and grow to just enormous sizes and can and probably do cause real problems by just eating everything else in their path. Well, it looks like maybe the best solution is for us to eat that.
Something I think we're all up for.
Yes, and so just like lionfish and other places, you know, one of the things that's changing is to start directing our fisheries is in some ways a way of controlling some of the species that, you know, have gotten a little out of hand.
Yeah. And can you tell us where Cirque is? And I know there's an 1812 War of 1812 story with Cirque too.
The 1812 story, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to tell. You probably know that one better than I do. But Cirque is, like you said, Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and we're in Edgewater, which is just a little south of Annapolis. We're on 2,600 acres of land on the Road River, so it's just an absolutely magnificent place to work. And people there do ecological research of all sorts, really all over the world. We have the longest running experiments on the effects of rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere of any place in the world.
Wow.
It's a great group of people. And we're having our open house next weekend, so come on down.
Beautiful time of year to be in
Yes.
Edgewater. So I just want to wrap up before we turn it over to the audience with it. What do you think is the future story about the Chesapeake Bay region? What's one thing that you're all hopeful about as we look at the changes that have happened and what people have grown and what people eat and what's happening now?
I think the hopeful thing is the rising interest in sustainable practices, and the sort of farm-to-table movement is making people more aware of, you know, their environment and what's happening there and their connection with where their food is coming from.
And it's my hope that in keeping with that, we'll keep in mind cultural sustainability and that not all cultures eat the same foods, nor do they want to eat the same foods. And so the ways in which people acquire, prepare, and distribute food is going to be different, whether it's through farm to table, whether it's through farming, whether it's through buying from these industrialized places that we don't like to talk about. How people acquire and manage food is going to be different across cultures. I think we need to keep
That's
that in
really
mind.
interesting. And when you say cultural sustainability, can you talk a little bit about that idea?
Sure.
That
That
is-
concept is just what I was saying, that different cultures maintain and engage food differently. And so we tend to talk about sustainability from the three sort of economic, social and political, but there is this cultural aspect that needs to recognize that not everyone engages food the same ways. So a one size model doesn't fit all. Not everyone wants to garden, not everyone wants to farm. And we need to be more relaxed in the ways in which we encounter people and engage them around their food cultures.
I think that's a really important part of the story. We have heard a lot from people who've said really the way to do it is to do everything. You have to have the whole widespread of everything around food and food
Absolutely.
systems in order to take on the challenges that are
Yeah,
impacting food today.
absolutely.
And I think including those sort of cultural perspectives has been an important part of the process in trying to improve the health of Chesapeake Bay and develop sustainable fisheries, because fishing in this region is a way of life.
A
and
way
it's
of life,
culture.
yeah.
It's not just a source of income.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So we are going to open it up to questions from the audience. I feel like there's so much more I want to say to all of you, but I will hand that power over to the audience. So we have a few people with microphones in the audience and a question over here.
Why did you choose the menu for tonight? What relevance did that have to the Chesapeake?
Okay, so the question was, why did we choose the menu for tonight? What was the relevance to the region? So we used our chef used a lot of the ingredients that could be found in this region. We also did a lot of research about what people were eating at different times around the region. We have a great dessert coming out called Smith Island cake, which is really both a fabulous dessert and a fabulous story. And if you don't know about that, do you want to answer the? I know there's a little feedback happening.
Right. No,
Okay.
yeah. No, I don't want to answer that.
Okay.
I won't get it right.
Paula is the Smith Island cake expert, so not to put you on the spot,
yeah,
but if you
then,
want to tell
Paula,
a quick
please.
Smith Island cake story, I think that would be great. Can you just stand in front of the camera?
Well, Smith Island is the only inhabited offshore island in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, and it is a place where people since the 17th century have been making their way, both as farmers and fishermen. And there is a tradition there for a multi-layered cake. When they say we're making a 10-layer cake, and you imagine a big, large
Yes.
thing, you're thinking the wrong way, because it's actually very, very thin layers.
Yeah.
And this is a tradition that started with the ladies of Smith Island, and they continue to make these cakes, and now they have a business and sell them actually at Giant Food. So,
There you go.
But it's great because it's a way for the women of the island to help maintain their island way of life.
Tradition.
Great. Yeah, but good question, and we did put a lot of thought into it. Yes, and another question over here.
Thank you very much. I hope you allow an English girl to ask.
Even though we're talking about the War of 1812, we'll allow it.
My question's for Denise. I had understood that sometimes aquaculture isn't very good for the system, but I thought that oysters perhaps weren't that way, and we've got more oysters in aquaculture now in the Chesapeake. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a very huge difference in the ecological impact of finfish aquaculture compared to bivalve shellfish like oysters or mussels. And the reason is, if you're going to grow finfish, you have to be bringing in food, and then they're releasing all their wastes into the water. And a number of years ago, there were some numbers put together looking at, for example, salmon farms off of Vancouver Island that were producing, sorry, I know you're all eating, but you invited a biologist to the table here, and they were essentially releasing more waste directly into the water than the city of Seattle would, and of course Seattle uses sewage systems. On the other hand, things like oysters are filtering out the food that's already in the water, and so whatever they're doing is actually tends to be beneficial. I mean, if you crowd too many into a little area can cause some problems, but in general, there's just a very big difference between shellfish and finfish aquaculture.
So an important distinction to make in aquaculture depends on what you're culturing in the story. Good question. Another question over here? We'll get to this side too if you have any questions, I promise.
As far as I thought, the dominant crop for the area was tobacco at the time. Is that correct?
So the question is about the predominant, and you're talking about during the War of 1812 time period, right? So what was the predominant crop in the Chesapeake Bay region during that time period?
Yeah.
Well, it certainly started out as tobacco. There was a transition process to a grain-based agriculture,
Maize.
but they were certainly still growing a lot of tobacco. I was kind of focused on food crops.
The eating crops. But that is an important distinction between what you're growing and not eating and what you're growing and eating and how those are different too. Any other questions from our audience? We're trying to pump up the side. We've all heard about the Smith Island cake, so now you're ready to go.
Here we go.
All right, one more question.
Well, speaking of grains, what grains were grown?
So what grains were people growing in this region during
You had,
the early 19th century?
Brands, maize, other kinds of, you had beans and legumes as well. So in addition to the grains, what others? Can you think? Wheat is a major one, yeah. So it turned into, as I said, the gang system with enslaved people were working with tobacco, and then turned to wheat and maize and brands and so forth.
Can you also just explain the gang system, task system, and
Sure,
how that works?
yeah. The task system is just what it says. You have a particular task, and so your time is not necessarily from sun up to sundown. It's until you finish the task that you're working on. With the gang system, you're under constant production because the cycle never ends, and so there could be planting and picking and all of those occur at different times, but it's just nonstop. So that's why I was saying that enslaved people didn't necessarily have the same freedoms in Maryland that you may have found in some other places that were running off of a task system from morning till night for 12 hours. That's how long you work. And for many of the women who were enslaved, as you might imagine, not only did you go from working in the field or in the house, but then you had to also make clothes, nurture your children, other people's children. You were cooking, so your work never ended. So the infant mortality rate was really high in this time period in the Chesapeake.
It was sort of a revelation to me when I was doing the research for the African American garden that you and I talked about earlier. I was looking at protein sources that slaves had in their typical diet. Sound like things we would never want to eat, and you begin to realize, well, when did they have time to secure protein by hunting? First of all, they didn't have guns, so they were using traps, and that sort of thing. And they were doing it at night because that's the only time they had. Thus, possum stew.
Possum,
because that's what you can find at night.
You had snake, possum, squirrel, rodents. Whatever you could attract, and a lot of wild herbs and plants. The other thing I just want to briefly mention, we also have to remember you had Muslims who were a part of enslaved systems in the Chesapeake, and so there's this misnomer that all African Americans who were enslaved ate scraps of pork, and that's not actually true because you had people who did carry their religions with them. So.
And was that more? And why was that more prevalent in this area?
Well, because of course, slavery was a business, and so people were brought here from particular regions of the African continent. So, for example, in the Chesapeake, in the Maryland Chesapeake, you're talking about the Senegambia region, so Senegal, Gambia, other areas of the West Coast, and so coming here, they're again bringing their traditions and life ways with them, and so you did have some Muslim practitioners there.
Fascinating. Yes, we have a couple more questions over here, and then I promise Smith Island cake.
Hi. The Professor Williams' person. Maybe
Yes.
this is a question for you, but maybe the rest of the panel too.
Okay.
So Michael Twitty, who you probably know, talks a lot about, he's an historic interpreter of foodways from the South and the Chesapeake. So he talks about this cultural sustainability piece and gives an example of a product that's made at Woodbury Kitchen, the snake oil that Chef Spike makes with the fish peppers grown by several farmers, including an African-American farmer.
Yes.
I just wondered if you had any examples of other modern products that in sort of the day and age of vote with your fork that embody what you're talking about in terms of cultural sustainability.
Right. Well, one of the ingredients that was brought over on these slave ships was palm oil. And so you still today have a prevalent use of palm oil in and around, particularly in this region, because we have so many folks from the African continent. But in terms of African American and African admixtures, I would say I would find it more in the food preparations. So I don't have that bit of information that Michael has. But in terms of, you know, how foods are seasoned and prepared, I would say would be more the sort of modern day cultural sustainability element.
Great questions, and I know we could keep the questions going, and that's why we have another hour in the garden, but we do have one more question. I'm getting the sign, so.
Oh, sorry.
Perhaps we were just discussing the diet of the slave population, and along the Chesapeake, I heard that terrapin soups or stews were very popular, but the terrapins are on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
Could Dr. Breitberg perhaps comment about why that's happening?
Terrapins, for those not from this region, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, they're aquatic turtles that are really common in Chesapeake Bay. They're certainly far less abundant than they were. One of the problems that they're having is the availability of beaches to breed on.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not actually an expert on it. So I'm not totally sure on other causes. There was for a long time the fishing of them wasn't well restricted, and also the crab pots that used to be allowed often caught them and drowned them. But they've put turtle excluder devices in some of the crab pots, and they've controlled the catches on them. But I'm sure that there are other issues going on.
I also want to point out that we've been talking about the Chesapeake for almost a half hour, and that's the first time anyone said crabs. So another important story in the Chesapeake region, which we haven't even touched on. Okay, so thank you all. That was fascinating. A huge thanks to our panel.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'm sure. Thank you. And there's plenty more to learn this evening. We have Pat Reber out in the garden, who is a culinary historian, and will be demonstrating some historic cooking tools as well. We have the folks from Mount Vernon Distillery, who can talk to you about the history of distilling in this region. We also have, again, Flying Dog Brewery here to discuss their aquaculture that they're working on as well. Most of you have probably seen Commodore Joshua Barney walking around, who is being played by Dr. Ralph Eshelman. And then we also have Smithsonian Gardens, who is highlighting the very fish pepper that we were just talking about. They'll have some of those, and they can tell you a great story about how bee stings actually kept the pepper alive. And there's lots more to discuss as well. So before I end, I also wanted to introduce our director, John Gray, who is here tonight. If you just want to stand up, John, and say hello. We also have the director of Smithsonian Gardens with us, Barbara Faust, as well, who can say hello, too. So they're both fabulous folks to talk to about what we're doing here at both institutions. So next week, we'll be right back here to talk about the Great Lakes region. We hope to see you then, and enjoy your Smith Island cake, which will be brought out by the chef shortly. Thank you.